It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Hunt. Swanee Hunt is the director of the Women and Public Policy program at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. In addition, she is chair and president of Hunt Alternatives Fund, a private foundation advancing innovative and inclusive approaches to social change at local, national, and global levels. From 1993 to 1997, she served as ambassador to Austria. During her tenure, she hosted negotiations and several international symposia focused on stabilizing the neighboring Balkan states. Hunt became a specialist in the role of women in post-communist Europe, and in July 1997, she launched Vital Voices, Women in Democracy, a conference convening 320 women leaders in business, law, and politics from 39 countries. She began her career addressing economic and social changes facing the Denver community. She funded more than 400 neighborhood-based organizations tackling issues including violence prevention, job creation, public education, and leadership development. She worked with a number of elected officials to advance children and family services, mental health reform, affordable housing, and solutions to homelessness. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serving on the boards of Crisis Group and USA for UNHCR, Hunt consults with government officials and civil society leaders around the world. She has authored numerous chapters for edited books and articles for newspapers and journals, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Herald Tribune, Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, Denver Post, and Dallas Morning News. Her book, This Was Not Our War, Bosnian Women Reclaiming the Peace, won the 2005 PEN New England Award for Nonfiction and includes a foreword by former President Clinton, and her memoir, Half-Life of a Zealot, was published in October 2006. Hunt has also provided news commentary and analysis on a number of international and domestic programs, including CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and CBS Evening News. She holds 2 master's degrees, a doctorate in theology, and 3 honorary degrees. She is married to the symphony conductor, Charles Ansbacher, and they have 3 children and a parrot. Ambassador Hunt.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this working okay? Is it doing anything? Well, I can't get any closer. It was working, was it? But yes, it is. It is now. Okay. I just spoke to my husband right as the car pulled up here. We've been off in Kyrgyzstan for a week, and he went from New York to a home in Cambridge, and I came out here. And he reported that the parrot is in good shape. So the parrot's name is Leopold. If you know anything about African history, it's an African gray. It's not a good sign, having a parrot named Leopold. Now, I'm awfully glad that in the introduction you talked about my work in Denver, the neighborhood-based work, because what I'm going to say is going to surprise you based on that work. Because I am such a huge believer in neighborhood-based, grassroots, nonprofit sector work. And I am going to go in the other direction in what I'm talking about. But let me ask, how many of you have ever volunteered for a nonprofit? Okay, oh, yes, right. Okay, why didn't you? What's wrong with you? And the next question is, are we going to be able to make this darker? So, okay, is that the best we can do? Okay, I think the problem is actually, it's going to be the windows more than anything. All right, but to the extent that there are more lights you can turn off, that would be a good thing. Okay, so you know the importance of nonprofits, right? And how many of you have ever considered running for office? Uh-huh. Keep your hands up. Yeah. Okay. All right. So about 2/3 men to women, and that's something we're going to talk about here. I could talk about many things, and if you want to ask me about other things when we have some question time, please do. But particularly, I wanted to tell you about some observations I had made after our last kid left home, which was great. I swear, none of this empty nest syndrome. My husband and I, he had traveled and traveled, and I had traveled and traveled, but we always traveled separately. And so we traveled together some, and we went to about 12 or 20 countries, something like that. And it was in the fall 2 years ago. And as we were going, I said, there's something brewing. I don't know what it is, but I'm seeing something. Because every place we would go, he would usually conduct orchestras, and I would meet with women leaders, because that's what I love to do. And I've done it in maybe 40 countries, worked with women leaders. So I said, after we were about halfway there, there's really something that's starting to gel here, but I can't even put it into words. And it wasn't until we got to Kyrgyzstan that it all gelled for me, because it was so extreme there. And I'll tell you about sitting in this meeting with about 9 journalists. And I knew that Kyrgyzstan, their number of women in parliament had been decreasing, had gone from 30%, which was typical of the Soviet times, Eastern Europe, as well, gone from 30% down to 0. And there are many countries that you go to where it's 0, especially where it's been something higher. So I was really not just distressed, but interested in this. And so I said to these journalists, I said, what do you think the percentage of women leading civil society organizations is? And one of them said, well, I think it's probably 80%. And another one said, I'd say 90. And then one journalist asked the group, can anyone name a man who's leading a significant anything in civil society? And they all sat there. And that's when it gelled for me, that there's leadership. There just is leadership. Certain number of women, certain number of men are, I won't say completely born leaders, because there are other factors too, but there's this kind of personality and drive that X percentage of people have. And so the question is, where do you lead? Where does that leadership get channeled? And that's when it gelled for me. It was in Kyrgyzstan, that it wasn't going into politics, and instead it had to go somewhere. And so it was going into civil society. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Okay, we get so excited about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, first woman elected in Africa, or Angela Merkel, etc., Michelle Bachelet. So there's all this thrill, but you know what? It's not that great. Only 20 female heads. Now, most countries have a head of state and a head of government. Our country is one of the exceptions, having them combined as one president. So this is actually much worse than you might imagine. And so, as I mentioned, I didn't mention, women are much more likely to work in the NGO area. Now, if you look at the gender gap in countries, which is to say, how are women faring versus how are men faring, the World Economic Forum says that in education and health, there's not a huge gap. Now, there's certainly in some countries a very big gap, but overall they're saying 90%. Actually, that it's 90% closed. That seems really high to me, but we'll find out. But look what they say about political empowerment at the higher levels. That there's this huge gap. That women have only 15% of what men do. Okay. How do they do it? How do women get into government at all? Well, there are 97 countries, this will surprise you, that have some kind of quota. Sometimes they say, well, we're going to reserve X number of seats in the parliament for women. Sometimes they say on the party list, you all remember that there are a lot of what's called proportional representation. That means that rather than running one person against another, you simply vote for the socialists, or you vote for the Greens, or you vote for the Liberal Party, and then each party has a list. And depending on what percentage of votes they get, that's the number of people from the list who get into the parliament. So some parliament lists have quotas, but look at this. If you take all the parliaments in the world, only 17% are women. And that's terrible. Does anyone know what the U.S. is? Raise your hand. Come on, you all. Yes, you're right. Anybody else? But you, that's what you do, is crunch numbers. Who else? What's the number? Good guess. It was 14 until the last election. And now it's 16. Y'all, that is slow progress. I mean, you could say, oh, well, that's great, you know. It's not great. I mean, it would take us, 200 years to get to parity. I don't have that worked out. But, I mean, seriously, it would take forever at that rate. Now, ministerial level, and you know what we're talking about in the U.S., that's like Secretary of Labor, Secretary of State. That's what ministers mean. Doesn't mean the church. 14%, and most of those are like the Minister of Gender, the Minister of Youth and Sports, etc. So, this is very bad, essentially. In the U.S., where women were denied the vote for all those years and then finally got the vote in 1920, we are 68th in the world. 68th? Yes. And so you say, oh, yeah, but we've got Nancy Pelosi third in line. We've got some really strong women senators. But, I mean, these are the stats. They're not good. And I couldn't resist this one. This is President Bush signing the bill banning what they called partial birth infanticide. Some people would call it late-term abortion, most of which are done, almost all of which are done to save the life of the mother. At any rate, it just the picture says it all. Like, how many of these legislators have ever been pregnant? All right, so let's look in the NGO community. It's a great world. I recommend work in NGOs. By that I mean nonprofits. I don't mean to discourage you at all, but look, there are 230 NGOs representing 10 million American women in this national council. And this is what the face of these women's NGOs look like. They're headed by women, and women by far are the driving force in the NGO world. And so what we see is that women are going into these positions of leadership, such as in academia and in philanthropy. Have you all followed what's happened in academia in terms of the Ivy League? I mean, look at these schools. It's now almost commonplace for a woman to be the head of a major academic institution. I was just at Drew Faust's inauguration, in fact, just a few weeks ago, where she became the president of Harvard. But they're not in politics. Now, how can this be if they're moving forward in all these places? Okay? Well, here's what happens in politics. And I was over in Vienna for 4 years. And as you know, Austria is surrounded not by Western Europe, but by what we called Eastern Europe. It's now called Central. Okay, so if you go around, it's the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary and Slovenia that surround Austria. So I spent a lot of time in those countries and learned a lot about it, and found that countries like Lithuania, and this was typical of countries in Eastern Europe, they had the quota, and then as soon as the quota was lifted, the numbers started dropping. And interestingly, that's when the parliaments became more powerful as well. Because I know, it took me a while to realize that. Under communism, where you have a one-party state, the parliament is really much more of a rubber stamp. So as soon as the parties started having influence and there wasn't a quota, the numbers started dropping. This is really important to realize, that the trend line isn't always up. And so you have to work really, really hard to combat something that's happening naturally. But the question is, why is it happening naturally? What is their natural about women not being in political leadership. And look at these numbers. Go back one more. I mean, there's the Kyrgyzstan example. I think you have to go back twice. But in China, these are some of the countries we were in. Charles and I, as we were traveling around, China has this all-women's, the All China Women's Federation. It's very important, but it's like an NGO. And there are no women in the really top political leadership, or you'll find one out of the top 50 of the political leaders in China. Now, the reason that's so important to point out, I mean, China, one of the main principles of these communist countries is the equality. Not just different ethnic groups, but also gender equality. Let's get these women out there on the tractors next to the men. And yet, even in those situations, you find that they're not in the Politburo, they're not in their upper echelons of decision-making. By the way, the women in South Korea, they doubled that number from 7 to 14 in one election. And remind me to tell you how they did it, because it's relevant to this conversation. Okay? Now, so what? Right? I mean, this is a bunch of stats until you ask the question, does it matter? I think it does. But before I tell you why it does, please understand I'm going to talk about women, I'm going to talk about men. I'm going to get away from the stats. And it's never one particular woman or one particular man. As you know, if you do research, you'll find often gender differences. Like, for example, in aggression. But that doesn't mean that you won't find a lot of women who are much more aggressive than a lot of men. It means that the bell curves, if you will, are not in the same place. So you have overlapping curves. Are you following me on that one? So there's you'll find fewer women who are as aggressive as a lot of men, but that doesn't mean you're talking about all men or all women. And in terms of women at the top politically, it really does make a difference how she got there, because if she's there because of her husband or father, Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, you're hearing a lot about these days, was there because her father was a political leader. Now, that isn't to say that she's not a great, courageous, bright, charismatic leader, but it makes a difference how you get to those positions. There are some women now who are rising to the head of a country, who are coming up through the women's movement in that country. And you can expect, and in fact find, that those women will have much more consistently, what shall I say, women typical kinds of priorities. And we're going to talk about what that means. So don't think that because a country has a woman president, that woman president automatically is going to be representative of some of the things I'm going to talk about as being typical of women, because they get there through all kinds of ways. They get to the top. See, I knew you were going to ask me about Hillary, so I thought I'd put that one in there before you did. All right, so what is different about women versus men in these positions? Well, obviously, they come from different life experiences. And they will tell you over and over and over that they learned certain things running the family, that they have figured out certain things that men haven't necessarily figured out, because they're spending huge numbers of hours with these kids. They think outside the bomb, right? They tend to be thinking about, we've got to figure out a way to stop the fighting. A friend of mine in Kenya said it this way. She said, what women want and what men want is different. And again, she's talking about these broad social norms. She said, men care a lot about territory. They want a whole state. It's huge to them where the boundaries are. Women want a safe place for their kids to get to school and back without getting raped, kidnapped, or murdered, or mutilated. So That's what I mean about thinking outside of the bomb. They're not thinking in terms of the military solutions. They tend to be thinking about their kids and their grandkids and the like. Oh, I don't have this in here. World Bank has a figure that if you give $100 to a man and give $100 to a woman, the effect on child mortality is, and it's huge, is it 20-fold or 200-fold different? But anyway, it's ridiculously large. The difference between whether or not it will make a difference to that child, their children living longer. Okay? And that's because women use the money differently. They'll use it for school, they'll use it for health care for their kids, etc. So these women are thinking about kids and grandchildren, and they tend to be very interested in women's advancement. They have a certain empathy for other women. So they do come in with a different perspective, and I'm sorry you can't see better. There's Aloysia Inyumba from Rwanda, whom I was talking to some people about earlier. Paul Kagame made her in charge of all of the funds for the Rwandan Patriotic Front. She was 21 years old, and she said to me in an interview, I've done hour-long interviews with about 500 women in different conflict areas, and she said to me, the assumption is among our leaders that women will be less corrupt, that we will be more trustworthy. Now, I'm not saying every woman and every man, but there's actually some very interesting gender research right now coming out of the Kennedy School that is doing in a laboratory these kinds of prisoner's dilemma kinds of tests. You know, I'll give you $10, I have 10, or the other person has $10. Do you all know how that works? Where you have to, can anyone say it in 2 sentences? The prisoner's dilemma. I've got to learn those 2 sentences. Where if you both do what you say you're going to do, you both end up winning, but you don't win as big as if you cheat the other person. So the question is, are you going to cheat the other person? Okay, are you going to cheat the other person with the chance that you're going to then take away even more? And there is a gender difference, and this has been studied in 5 different cultures. Women are not more trusting, but they are more trustworthy. They'll do what they say. The other picture I have up there is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who, if you know her career, was the finance minister of Liberia. It was a terribly corrupt situation with Charles Taylor. She was then put in prison and tortured, and eventually left, worked for the World Bank, worked for the UN, then ran for president of Liberia, lost. She got 13% of the vote, not good. Then went back and ran again and just was elected less than 2 years ago. She walked into the Ministry of Finance. She says, I know how this place works. Let me see anyone's employment cards. Nobody had employment cards. They had been in a 14-year brutal civil war. The Ministry of Finance didn't even have electricity, much less employment cards for their employees. And she said, this is the Ministry of Corruption. You're all out. You're all out. The new Minister of Finance that she appointed, a woman, came into an empty building, literally, and started over. She appointed a woman as Minister of Commerce. They did not have email. I think it's little trivia pieces you get from me. She told her new minister, she said, a contract may stay in this building, an application may stay in this building for 24 hours, that's it. Because before, the Minister of Commerce would take the application, it would disappear into a drawer somewhere until there was some cash, under the table. And then, oh, I found it, here it is, here's your application. So she has gone in determined to stamp out corruption in Liberia. Okay. It's not just Rwanda and Liberia. There's several studies coming out now, and none of these is totally definitive, but you start getting a picture. They're coming out of the World Economic Forum, Transparency International, that are saying that the higher the percentage of women in government, the lower corruption there is. And there's some meta-analysis done of that. But again, it's very hard to get really firmly into the causality until you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Okay, in terms of economic competitiveness, on the next slide. Never mind, let's look at that one, which is from the Wharton School. And then there's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. No, this is the International NGO Training and Research Center. You hear a lot of this qualitative reporting that women have higher ethical standards. But what you really need to do is put together a picture from a lot of different sources to test this out. Because otherwise you get people talking from their gut. You know, in my experience, I find that. So let's keep going and see about economic competitiveness. And by the way, I just heard a fabulous presentation from your shop here, and it's women's stats. Women's stats, and some of the coders are here in the audience, so I'm kind of in fear and trembling here when I talk about research. But what you all here have under women's stats, look it up, because you have one of the great, great resources for this subject. So the question is, you know, in the Nordic countries, you know, where you have a much higher percentage of women in the parliament, 47% in Sweden, I don't remember the other countries, but they're way up there, Finland and Norway, etc. And then you have these very solid economies. So did having the solid economy lead to the higher percentage of women? Or might there be some other relationship? So here you have some very poor countries like Mozambique and Rwanda and Costa Rica that have very high percentages, and these are not thriving countries. So it looks like it's not just that you had a rich country and therefore you have a higher percentage of women. Okay? So the percentage of women, in addition to or what women bring, in addition to the trustworthiness and the values and the economic competitiveness, there's the issue of how do people feel generally about their government when you have a low percentage of rulers versus a high percentage. And in fact, the Interparliamentary Union, which is in Geneva and which measures what's happening with parliaments all over the world, saying they did this poll, and they say that there is a relationship, that when you have a high amount of women's representation, there is much more of a sense of public trust. And these countries included, you know, they were from all over the world, so from El Salvador to Russia. And they talked about that when you have a higher percentage of women, you end up with these tangible improvements throughout the society. The other thing that women bring, the last thing I'll mention, I think there are a lot more, is that they often come out of the civil society work. And when I say civil society, I'm talking about NGOs, academia, the media. Some people count business when they talk about civil society, but the point is that it's what makes the society work that is not government. Now, you take someone like Bachelet in Chile. She actually had worked with the children of the people who'd been tortured under the junta. The South Korean prime minister, a woman, had been imprisoned for her political activism. And I was interviewing a South Korean assembly member who was actually very right-wing, and she said her model, the person she most wanted to be like in the whole world, was Condoleezza Rice. This was before Condoleezza Rice went over to be Secretary of State, when she was in her much more hardcore positions, I would say, in the White House. And so even this woman, Song Yung-sun, who I would describe as very conservative, when I asked her about what is security to you, she said, oh, well, you know, that means safe food, and, you know, clean water, etc. It means having schools. So her definition of security was very broad, because there was this sense of empathy with the family life, in part, and feeling very close to the grassroots. And that's what you often find women saying, that they are more in touch with the practical everyday realities. One of them said to me, I know how much a bag of rice costs. You know, these members of the parliament, they don't have a clue about how much a bag of rice costs. Okay, so if we've said that the women aren't there, and if we said that it would make a difference, then why on earth aren't they there? Well, these women, they give a lot more than 6 reasons, but I'll tell you, these ones keep coming over and over. And I just asked, I was just in Kyrgyzstan, and in fact, I didn't even ask the question. There was a woman who was talking about whether she was going to run for parliament, and she spent an hour, as this woman I was saying is the social fund, she spent an hour telling me all the reasons that she was not going to, and they went 1 through 6 through these that I am going to present to you. The first is they say, it's dirty, and I'm not going to get in there and let my hands be sullied. Now, you see the circle here? That if women say they won't get in because it's dirty, and I'm saying that women do better on the corruption scale, then it stays dirty, or it gets even dirtier. Oh, go back one more. This is a woman in Kyrgyzstan whom I was encouraging to run. She heads the Forum of Women's NGOs. And she said, look, I've got 2 kids that I've got to put through college. If I'm in the assembly, I get $60 a month or something like that. Now, I promise you that these assembly members who are driving around in Mercedes-Benzes are not living off of their $60 a month. All right? They're finding cuts. You know, they're walking away with a lot of money. But if you're not willing to do that, then you cannot afford to be in the assembly. It's kind of like if you're a waiter or a waitress, you've got your base minimum wage, and then you've got tips. Think of the tips as the corruption part, because you can't make it on what they're going to pay you as your base salary. Okay. So there's the dirty game piece. This is the other thing I was saying about the practical. Maggie Thatcher said, it may be the cock that crows, but it's the hen that lays. I love that one. I don't have statistics about this. All I can tell you is that I hear it over and over and over, women saying, look, I want to get things done, therefore I'm not going to be in politics. Now, isn't that sad? I mean, that's really, really sad. Third, they say, no, I can't get into politics because it's really a man's world. In our society, they always say in our society. But you hear this in almost every society. You know, that everyone thinks that theirs is unique. Well, in a sense it is, but here's a quote from Bob Rothberg at Harvard about women in Africa, but you find the same thing. You know, in Chile and in Mexico, I gave you these stats. These are the percentage of women who say that men make better political leaders. 45% of the women in Mexico said men make better political leaders. That's rough. That's really rough, because they see it as this man's world. Do you all know this wonderful study where they took psychological counselors, so people who ought to be thinking beyond the stereotypes. So they said, okay, I want you to choose an adjective that describes the ideal man. And they were given opposites, like polarities, like aggressive, passive, right? Extrovert, introvert. And then so they got their list of adjectives, and they said, okay, I want you to choose this, with using these same polls, describe the ideal woman. Well, the ideal woman tended to be the opposite of the ideal man. If you had to choose, like you didn't really want to use these adjectives, but if you had to. Then they said, okay, now choose the adjectives for the ideal leader. Now, you know the end of the story, right? The ideal leader matched the ideal man. Which means that every morning I get up, I look in the mirror, and I have to decide if I'm going to be Swanee Hunt, if I'm going to be the ideal woman or the ideal leader. Now, that's pretty rough. And that's what women politicians face all the time. They stand up in front of a group knowing that if they're tough, that they're going to be described as strident for saying exactly the same thing that a man would say. Even if they say it in a more gentle voice, it'll be called strident. So that's very, very rough. And that will change as we have a lot of women in leadership. Because, like, for example, y'all don't remember this, the younger ones of you. By the way, y'all is the plural form of you used in Texas, okay, where I'm from. We could not imagine a woman as Secretary of State. I mean, it couldn't be. Women were not equipped to make those decisions. I mean, you know, like once a month when they had their periods, they might start a war. I don't know. I just, you know, we could not imagine this. And then Bill Clinton appointed Madeleine Albright. And all of a sudden, when Condi Rice, when that question came up, of course she could be. And that was because there had been a Madeleine Albright. And so it really breaks the images. So this business about the man's world, that is changeable, and that can change, but you have to get a lot of women in there to change it. Okay, the fourth is this business. Now, you all, by the way, this is what comes up first. But I don't like to put it first because it's one you already expect. So I save it for the fourth. I kind of bury it in the middle. They say it over and over and over. I can't be a good mom and be in politics. I remember Gloria Steinem said, I'm waiting for the day when a man comes in and says with terrible look on his face and great angst, I don't see how I can be in politics and be a good enough dad. You know? But women walk around with this feeling all the time. Pat Schroeder from Colorado went into the U.S. Congress with 2 young children. Not with her, but, you know. Actually, I think she did take them in for her swearing in. This was absolutely unheard of 30 years ago. And there was all kinds of nasty things said about this. And one man said, how can you be a good mother? And what right do you think you have to be a congresswoman and have young children? And she said, that's because God gave me a brain and a uterus. You know? So, but women have been up against a lot in terms of the judgment of others. It's not just what they carry around inside themselves. But once they got the numbers up in Norway, they passed a rule saying that, oh, you should run some more of these, that we will not have meetings after, 6 o'clock. There will be no meetings of the parliament or any of the committees. So all of a sudden, you found that when you got women in, they could change the institution which was so unfavorable to women. It's not just their own angst. Often you have husbands who say, well, you can get into office, but I want my hot dinner every day. You know, kids generally don't like it. In-laws put a lot of pressure on women not to get in to office. By the way, you notice I didn't say Islam? Because it's really fundamentalists across the board who say that a woman's place is in the home, she shouldn't be in the political arena. So let's not be stereotypic here and say this is about Muslim cultures. Okay, onward. Then there are very specific roadblocks that women face. For example, they don't have the funds to even file for office. In some countries, it's $10,000 even to say that you want to run. And women who have not been heading up the businesses or have not been able to inherit property literally are banned from inheriting property in some countries. They don't have this kind of money. Often women, by the way, have said to me, if I have to choose between shoes for my children and running for office, I'm going to choose shoes for my children. And of course, I would say to them, but in the big picture, if you're in that office, you can be thinking about shoes for a lot of people's children, but it's very hard to get out of that immediate situation in terms of your thinking. Then you have the male political leaders. I talked to a woman in central Bosnia in Mostar. It's 2 hours from Sarajevo. She said that she was number 3 on the party list when she left Mostar. By the time she arrived in Sarajevo, the day of the election, she was number 23. Because all the guys had gotten together and they made sure that they had the top places. And by the way, look around at the political parties. Often you have a number 2 who's a woman, but it's almost always, unless you're in the Nordic countries, it's almost always a man who's at the top. So when there are meetings of the leaders of the political parties, it'll be 20 guys in a room. Okay, I talked about the big money. Oh, the physical harm. Another friend in Africa, this was again in Kenya, she said that there was a rape campaign against women who were running, so that she and her other women friends would wear 2 pair of trousers, and they would put a knife in the pocket of one, and then they would put a dress over that, so they would have longer to scream as if they were being raped. That's very, very hard to handle for the whole family, in terms when your mom comes home and says, I've decided to run, when you know there's a rape campaign, or in terms of what the husband says or the parents say. All right. Oh, I hate this one. But it's there. Women, that next to the family concerns, this is probably the biggest one. This may be the biggest one. Women perceive themselves as not having the same competence as men. Psychologists call it negative illusion, and men have positive illusion. In fact, there's some very interesting research being done, and Rose McDermott is part of this, that is looking at whether testosterone, rather than making you more aggressive, actually gives you positive illusion, guys. In other words, I ask a question. I'm at the Kennedy School. It's all really, really, really smart people. They're just as smart as each other. I ask a question. 14 hands go up. 13 of them belong to guys, And they haven't even figured out what they're going to say, but they know it's going to be brilliant, whatever it is, And the women are sitting there pondering and pondering, and I say, why don't you put up your hands? And they say, well, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if what I'm going to ask really is the right thing, if it was relevant to what you were saying. I don't want to take the airtime if it's not really well thought out. By the way, what happens then after class? The professors get all these emails from the women. Really interesting. Now, I just heard a panel that I love. It was all 4 brain researchers. And they had come together at Harvard. And what they were doing is looking at MRIs now and whether or not women's and men's brains are functioning the same way. And you'll be very interested to know that, in fact, what you're experiencing in your relationship has a lot more to do with brain function than it does with characterological flaws. And that is that guys basically go from stimulus to action. Women go from stimulus to left brain, right brain, all this prefrontal cortex stuff going on as women consider, think. I mean, it's a riot when you look at the difference, except it's very hard on relationships, right? And the guys can't figure out why these women are second-guessing this and wondering about that. Isn't it just plain and simple? Can't we just get on with it? All right. Even when they have the same credentials, the women, they say that they probably won't win. Maybe you can talk them into running. You have to ask them 3 or 4 times. And when they do, the women run for dog catcher and the men run for U.S. Senate. It's extraordinary. There's a wonderful book called It Takes a Candidate. And it's why women don't run for office. And these 2 authors, they have all the research there that are showing women's low self-esteem on this. When you take Harvard Business School grads And so, I mean, these are really accomplished people, same background. They graduate. The company offers the guy $100,000. And no, they offer the woman, let's say, $100,000. She says, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes. And then they say, okay, guy, how about, here's a job for you for $100,000. And he says, how about 110? Employer says, okay. The guy will ask for a raise 14 months before the woman will. Now, you think about that across a career. You start out higher, and you ask for raises much more quickly. You know all that griping women do about why aren't we in those top positions? Well, part of it is because of this. We hate negotiating. We don't like competing. But on the other hand, if you tell women, you know, if you get more, you can give it away to someone who needs it. There are all these lab tests that do this. The gender difference disappears. So women will negotiate on behalf of somebody else. So it's not the negotiating that they don't like, it's negotiating for themselves that they don't like. It is, wow. Look up Hannah Riley. Hannah Riley Bowles. She was Hannah Riley when I met her. Hannah Riley Bowles. Done really interesting work on this. You know, come in and take a test, okay? I'm going to pay you as a grad student to take this test, and I'm going to give you a gift certificates to Starbucks for doing this little maze test. I'm going to time you. Well, of course, the test is not about the timing or the maze. The test is what you do with the gift certificate to Starbucks because it is blank. It doesn't have a dollar figure in it. So you take the gift certificate and you say, well, how much is this for? You fill it out. That's, you know, whatever you want. The women put, first of all, a lot of the women won't put anything because they just can't bring themselves to do it. They just won't make a decision. Then if they do, they'll put $3. The guys will put, you know, 15 or 30 or whatever. Ouch. Okay. Onward. So what do you do about it? This is just the shortest part because it's pretty evident. The good news is that there is something you can do. You don't just shrug your shoulders. There's a lot that a government could do, or the people who are doling out the foreign aid. You can link your organizations, your university or your foreign aid institution. You can link it to this issue and say, we are not going to give you, for example, aid for roads unless you can do something to bring up the percentage of women who are in decision making. And you can always say, you know, that's because we think women do better with decisions about roads, which is a little strange, but you know, there are ways to link it. You can also encourage what we call family-friendly politics. And I put this example up here because, you know, here you have the Moroccan example. Here you have a country that's Islamic that has Sharia law. And as you know, Sharia law is the family law that we so often say, well, that's the reason of all of the oppression of women in these countries. You know, has anyone read Leviticus recently? I mean, if you want to go into scriptures and find ways to keep women down, you can do that in almost any religious faith. And I don't know the Book of Mormon, but I bet there's some pretty terrible places in there related to women. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I just know, you know, my doctorate's in theology. I spent a lot of years working on biblical texts. And there's some awful stuff in there that we just say, oh, well, that was cultural. That's why we don't observe it now. Yeah. Okay, so they're in Morocco. And look, there were 2 women in the parliament, and then in 1 year it increased to 35. There are ways you can go in and you train women to run for office. You encourage them. By the way, as you'll see in that book, It Takes a Candidate, women generally need to be asked 4 times to run. And there are an awful lot of little boys running around who can't imagine themselves anything but the President of the United States. And they are not going to have to be asked. they're just going to be directing themselves toward that goal. The campaign financing rules, you can push to have, to drop the filing fee and make all of that more transparent. And I hate to put this one, but this is actually the highest cost for women running for office. I keep going back to Kenya because I know those stats. It's for bodyguards. And so you could have, because of the rape campaign, so you could actually have international organizations coming in and paying for bodyguards for women. And, since I don't remember the next slide, quotas. Now, as you know, the United States is allergic to quotas, right? I mean, it makes us shiver to think of quotas. Well, we are in the minority in terms of quotas, of not having any quotas. As I mentioned, there are all different kinds that you can have. Not that we're going to, but one of the factors that determines whether the quota system is going to work is whether or not you force people to observe it. There are a lot of places, there's some places that have quotas, but they're not being complied with. It also makes a big difference if you say that the women, if you're going to have, let's say, 25% women, it matters where on that party list the women are. So Israel, for example, some years ago, was very excited. They got 30% quota for women on the party list, but they weren't able to get it what they call in a zebra or a zipper way, where you have women being interspersed. So they all ended up at the bottom. And then another factor for the success of the quotas is whether women have other opportunities. In other words, can they easily have businesses? Do the laws allow them, as I said, to inherit property? Are they being given other leadership opportunities? Because that'll determine whether or not others think of them as qualified to be on the party list. Is there a last one? And then, of course, it's not just the number, it's also the quality. Oh, but let me tell you something. In Sweden, I have two friends who were in a very early group of women senators who came in. And these women are now in their 70s. And they both told me that the same women who were in the 10% of women at one point, when the women first came in, those same women voted, dressed, acted, talked differently when they were in 30%. All right, so in other words, when you're in a small minority, you don't vote or act or talk the same as you would if you were in a large minority or a larger percentage, because, well, there are all kinds of reasons. Just think psychologically. You know, guys, if you're one of two guys in a group of 15, you know, that's different from if you're one of 13 guys in a group of 15. Yeah? So it's the same dynamic in a parliament. So when we talk about quality, not quantity, actually the quantity helps determine the quality as well. And finally, we need more sway and less swagger. Alice Eagley is one of the great meta-analysts of how women behave. And in other words, meta-analysis is when you take a whole lot of studies, like you take 20 studies or 200 studies, and you look for what the overall findings are. Because these studies in and of themselves usually don't give you a definitive answer, but if you look at them as a block. And so I said, Alice, can you just summarize? And she said, yeah, the stereotypes are basically true. Yeah, that women tend to be more collaborative. They do a lot more encouraging in their style. They're looking for how you can transform a group, and the men tend to be making decisions. And again, I think that's what we're going to find corroborated with this difference in how the brains work too. women, I just gave you a few examples. I could give you about 600 of women around the world who operate by building coalitions. And they understand that that's their strength. But also, is it oxytocin? Is that there's this very interesting business about a brain chemical that is released, and it's with women when they're in a group. So when women are in a group, like, we think of them as like, loving slumber parties. Do y'all know what sleepovers and talk. Well, it turns out that there's actually something different happening in girls' brains or women's brains that isn't happening in guys. So there's a reason we're building coalitions. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't a lot of negativity that goes on and competition, but women, all of these women are working in politics. Hanan Ashrawi, one of the leaders of the Palestinians, Nomi Khazan was deputy speaker of the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, and they together have the International Women's Coalition trying to stop the war. Now, and finally, there's this notion of soft power. This is one that Joe Nye came up with. He was the dean of the Kennedy School, but before that, he was the assistant secretary of defense. And he said, in international relations, and that was his field, we think all the time about a stick or a carrot. How do we bribe this group to do something? How do we force them to do it? Let's go in and bomb them back to the Stone Age, even if they're already in the Stone Age. Yeah. But Joe said, Dr. Nye said, what if there's a different way? What if we can get people to do something because they admire us so much that we could actually influence them? And that's what he calls soft power. And he has said that women are one of the best examples of soft power, because women tend to think, instead of, forcing, let's say their kids, you will do this. They say, honey, let's think this through. Now, what's going to happen if you don't do this? They just do a lot of cajoling, and that's. I'm not talking about all women. You're sitting there thinking of your mother. This did not, your mother at piano practicing time. But there tends to be differences that among fathers and mothers, with the fathers tending to be much more authoritarian, and the women sitting down and sort of working through it with the kids. So if you apply that to nation states, you can be talking about the influence of hundreds of millions of people in terms of our public policies. All right, that is the presentation. And I welcome one more, and I welcome then your thoughts. Zainab Bangura, by the way, I said Sierra Leone activist. She just was appointed foreign minister about a week ago. I have the emails, and so I'm happy to add that now to this. But I bet you she would not have been appointed foreign minister if she hadn't run for president either. And that made her a real player.